All right, I'm just going to show you the workflow that I've been learning basically it's exporting from Houdini and getting your color data and different groups in Blender. This isn't really a Houdini tutorial so much, but somebody might be interested in how I did that actual torus thing. So I have a torus and I have a sphere, and we're going to use this attribute transfer later, but basically you got to have a sphere. I'm going to transform the sphere on the X, and then I'm going to add another transform, and I'm just going to add some animation data so that sphere is going to rotate, and it's rotating. Let's see, wireframe. You can see it's kind of rotating within the torus. It doesn't have to be exact. So then I want to use this attribute transfer, which does a great job of like transferring position information like between attributes. But in order to do that, I need to create some attributes. So I have an attribute create under the torus, and I'm just going to call this, you can call it anything, but it makes sense to call it Z scale because I will be using a poly extrude later that's what they call it, but you really can call it anything. So under the torus, we'll call it Z scale, and it's going to be a float, and it has a value of 0. Under the sphere, it's the same name, Z scale, but it's going to have a value of 1. So now when we do the attribute transfer, it transfers between 0 and 1 based on position. Let's see, attributes. We will just copy on the, let's make, it should be on the points. Actually, I think it should be on the primitive. So in your Z scale, let's switch that to primitive. But you could always change that later if it's not working. And then this, we're going to go to the primitives, and then there's our Z scale, and we want to transfer that. So in your attribute transfer, if you go over to conditions, you can increase the fall off, the blend width, and the distance threshold. So now we have this Z scale information, and I'm just visualizing it with the color. We don't actually need that. So let's go to poly extrude, and I'm going to tone that down a bit. And I had already set it in local control, I had set it to Z scale. So now if I change that blend width, that's basically how I did the torus. Okay, so what if you wanted to export this to Blender? And let's say I wanted to keep that color data. So let's just plug that color back in. Okay, so you do a ROP, a limbic output, and you give it a destination, and you're going to hit, if you want it to be an animation, set your frames and say render frame range and set this. The one thing about this is, let's say I set, here, 1 second. So here's my location. If I were to just call this test underscore 06, I need to make sure to add .abc. I know that I sometimes don't, and then Blender, when you try to import a limbic, it won't see that, but the easy fix is if you forgot to add abc, just go to the file and add a .abc, and then Blender will see it. So I'll hit accept, save to disk. It should go really quick. Really quick in Blender, you go file, import, abc. There's my test 06. Comes in. It kind of looks weird. If you could add normals in Houdini, we'll do that in a little bit, but if you do have weird geometry in Blender, you can always add a modifier edge split in Blender. So modifiers do work. And then the last thing I want to show you is in the node editor, if you you can also see it here in object properties, vertex color, we have a CD, which is pretty cool. So if I hit Shift A, go to input, vertex color, drop in CD, let's go to rendered, or this texture preview. I'm just going to hit Control Shift click. I have the node wrangler. So now I have a white and black gradient, and you can use a color mix. You can use this to drive the factor of. So I had like a red color and a blue color, and it was something like that. And then I added some other textures, but that's basically how you would export and get a little bit of info in the form of color data. Let's see what's next. So this was like a kind of a quick and dirty, and it did work. But one thing to note is this CD, I originally had it in Houdini. It was running over the primitives, and I can see that because I have my primitives selected, and there's color data there. And this sometimes works, but normally you want to promote that attribute back to the points. I found I've had better results when I do that, especially when things are more complicated. So let's make this a little more complicated. So I added in some extra, basically some noisy stuff where basically I took that 1 second. Okay, so I took that Z scale from the attribute transfer and I used delete by expression, and I delete by expression, and I said if at Z scale is less than 0.2, delete it. So that's deleting anything that was kind of in the gray to black area. Then I'm poly extruding that based on individual elements. So I just wanted it bigger, and then I'm basically poly extruding that to give it some thickness. I added an attribute randomize. I'm coloring that attribute, and right now it is also on the primitive, but let's promote it back to the points. So I added an attribute promote from primitive to point, and we'll choose CD. And so it does give you a different look, but sometimes it doesn't even work if you have it on primitives. So if we merge, yeah. The other stream is I just added some wires, and then if we merge all these together, we get something like this at the moment. So we gotta. I like to do some cleanup before I send it through this this ROP. So I want to make sure I can see all the colors, and I'll be back in a second and tell you how I cleaned it up. Okay, so basically the way I cleaned it up was I promoted all the color attributes back to points. So I make sure they're all in sync with each other. So up here when I had the attribute randomize, I made sure I promoted that back to points. The Z scale, I put back to points. And then over here, so these edges, which these will import into Blender as curves, but I found they don't animate that well. They look animated in the viewport, so you can do like a viewport render and you can add thickness to them like you could a curve in the viewport, but when you go to render, it always resets back to here. But so if you want this curved animation to work, you just gotta, so I'm gonna add a sweep, a circle with a polygon. I'm just gonna put them in Houdini as I'm basically adding the thickness in Houdini, and then I'm just giving it some color data, and it is on the points. So now they're all in sync. Okay. If you want to break this up into different materials in Houdini, is you create groups in Houdini, and then in Blender they're read as different materials. So that's pretty cool. And the easiest way to make a group, some of these poly extrudes, if you go to extrusion, you can see there's like output front or side. So like right here, this side is right there. But I can say I want a side group. So that'll be coming as a material called extrude side, and output front it's already doing. Let's do extrude front. So let's say you wanted to make like a random, like choose random polygons. So we're gonna run it over here because I did create some random color, and you actually don't want it at the end because all my color is on points, and I want to delete primitives. So let's do, or I want to group by primitives. So it's by primitives. Oops, group expression. So let's go to group expression. We'll say if at CDX, because I have this attribute randomize on color, is greater than 0.6, then group that. So now we have this group. You can see all those highlighted ones, and we'll call this like random. So that'll come in as a material. So now we have two ways of making materials in Blender. Actually doing it within the node, like the bevel node has these little check boxes, a group expression, or let's just do group, go here, have it run over primitives, we'll just call it selection, and let's choose those and hit enter. So now we have that group. Okay, so I don't want this to all be one object in Blender. I want to like split it up. So we've seen vertex color, we've seen materials, and now kind of the final part is splitting this all up. So this part you just kind of have to memorize if you're not great at Houdini, and I'm not great, so I memorized it. So in your ROP Alembic output, you want to say build hierarchy from attribute. So check that on, and you get this path attribute called path. And I can see it within my primitives. Actually, I will see that soon. So it's looking for this path. So if under this stream, which is this torus, I'm going to create an attribute wrangle. And you don't actually have to type out the whole, if I just type in ATT and W, it can like figure out I'm looking for an attribute wrangle. So I want this to run over primitives, that's important. And I'm going to say, so S at path. So S at path, and I'm going to just call it torus in quotes. And then you got to end it with a semicolon or it won't work. So now we have this, this path, and there's a torus. So if I hold Alt, slide this over, just for practice, S at path equals, in quotes, we'll call this boxes, and semicolon, and hit Control and Enter to like confirm it. And now we have, if we go to this merge, we have this path that's boxes, and then if I go down, there should be toruses. Oh, there we go. I gotta choose it. There's torus, there's box, and then there's this unknown, which we will name now. Wire boxes torus. Okay, so now basically I think if you export to Blender, things will be really good, but a few things that you might want to do is add some normals so it won't come in kind of yucky looking. So if we add normals here, it'll have good normals. And then I think it's good practice to do attribute delete and just clean up anything you don't need, because right now, oh, if you middle mouse click, it's kind of cool to see like, oh, here are our groups. We have extrude front, extrude side, random, and selection. And though it tells you how many primitives are in that. We have normals, we have 2 primitive attributes. So we want to keep path because that's where all the object names are. We don't need z-scale. So really, in our case, we don't need an attribute delete, but if you were going to, if you had a ton of stuff, you would just hit star, star, star to select everything. But now you just got rid of everything, so we want to say caret and then capital CD and make sure there's no space. And what else do we have? So in the vertex we want the caret, Shift 6, and normals, so that's capital N, so we keep our normals, and then here, most importantly, caret, and then path. So now we have, yeah, our path still. We'll go here, and I'll quickly, okay, so in Blender, so test 8. So now it came in, I'm going to hit M to move all these to a collection called Houdini. So we have our box, our boxes, our torus, and our wire. Okay, so but in this object, let's go to our materials, and we can see that we do have an extrude front, we have extrude side, and then we have this selection, which I've already been kind of messing with, which if you remember, that was our selection. So let's go to extrude front and just make sure we have some vertex data, and it looks really dark, but if I go to shade converter, color ramp, and if I bring that in, you know, I can see that there actually is stuff there. So that's cool. I'm just gonna go in and add basically in the vertex colors on each. So this is more or less what we got from Houdini. This is what it looked like in Houdini. This is what it looks like in Blender. Again, you can use modifiers in Blender, and so like this is kind of, oh, and our normals we didn't have to mess with, but like a bevel could be kind of cool, Um, yeah, I just turned off clamp overlap, and then you can add some bevel.